Good morning and welcome to today's session where we talk about the novel by Amitav Ghosh, The Hungry Tide. In this course, this is the second novel that we are discussing by Amitav Ghosh. The Hungry Tide, published in 2004, is Ghosh's sixth novel. It also won the Hutch Crossword Book Award in 2004. This is a novel which is set in the Sundarbans, which is also referred to as the Tide country in the novel. It narrates a history of forced evacuation of refugees from the island of Morukchapi. This also discusses certain issues related to environment and conservation, which also made it a hot favorite in terms of discussing this in the context of eco-criticism. Ghosh's post-colonial stance need to be briefly talked about before we enter this discussion. Ghosh is widely acclaimed as the one Indian English writer who shows no signs of anxiety while talking about India or while discussing anything related to Indianness. And it's more than evident in some of the political stances and positions that he adopts, especially in relation to the nation and the imperial power. He was in the news for when he withdrew his novel The Glass Palace from the list of contenders for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. The letter he wrote to the Commonwealth Foundation in 2001 is tellingly sharp about his post-colonial stance. I read to you an excerpt from the letter. So far as I can determine, The Glass Palace is eligible for the Commonwealth Prize, partly because it was written in English and partly because I happen to belong to a region that was once conquered and ruled by Imperial Britain. Of the many reasons why a book's merit may be recognized, these seem to me the least persuasive. I feel that I would be betraying the spirit of my book if I were to allow it to be incorporated within that particular memorialization of empire that passes under the rubric of the Commonwealth. So this is a very clear rejection of the idea of the Commonwealth and of the idea of a patronizing approach towards what is now known as Commonwealth literature. Towards the end of this course, we shall be also looking at an essay by Salman Rushdie titled Commonwealth Literature Does Not Exist. These are certain important moments which would help elevate Indian writing in English to a different status altogether, and not just as an extension of colonial writing, not just as an extension of anti-colonial nationalist sentiments. We find in the post-Rushdie generation, in the post-Ghosh generation, an evident Indian way of writing emerging, where it is no longer important to be under the patronage of the imperial colonial powers. Coming back to the novel, which is the focus of our discussion today, The Hungry Tide, the narrative is non-linear and it also brings in certain relics from the past. One of the important objects in this narrative is an old notebook from the past written by Nirmal, a retired schoolmaster who lived in the island of Lusibari. Lusibari is a fictional creation by Ghosh. Nirmal's notebook is read by his nephew Kanai Dutt, who is also the protagonist of this novel. Kanai remembers Nirmal's accounts of the 19th century settlers who tried to follow the call of one Daniel Hamilton. He was a Scotsman who envisioned an egalitarian society in the Sundarbans. This is written in the form of a story within a story. So we find the interweaving and the coming together of 1, the remembered past, and 2, the witnessed present. Both are brought together and time plays an important role, just like it did in the other novel that we discussed, The Shadow Lines, as well. So we find these different coordinates of time coming together to weave an interesting story from the past and present. There are two major concepts which are explored in detail. One, the plight of the displaced people, and secondly, it begins to address this question of how humans share a complex and dangerous ecosystem with animals. In the case of the novels, dolphins and tigers. These are the two major concepts around which the plot moves, and the relationships between the major characters are also based on their attitudes and their responses to these major issues. We find this novel very directly critiquing the state, the idea of history, and the individuals which are caught in it. It asks a very pertinent question whether the state is allowing the deaths of the islanders. More than once we will find a discussion reference to the official version of history, to the official count of the number of deaths in case of anything that happens in this island of Sundarbans. It also critiques the official version of history by challenging and contesting this official version with the local mythologies, which have the power to subvert the official and national versions of history. This novel, the narrative of this novel, is pitched against this official national version of the writing of history, especially the writing of regional histories. And in a novel like Shadowlines, the canvas was very large. Ghosh was looking at the idea of the nation, the idea of the boundaries which separate a nation from the other nation, and he was trying to critique the idea of this boundary which is also arbitrary in nature. In a novel like The Hungry Tide, he is focusing the attention, he is withdrawing into the nation and looking at the regional, the local, to show that, to showcase and illustrate that the local histories are also buried deep within. The local histories are also rendered invisible by the overarching importance and the overarching relevance accorded to the national official version of history. There are a few main characters. Piya Roy, who is a researcher from America, who is tracking rare dolphins. She is of Indian parentage, but she has lived her entire life in America. Kanai Dutt is a Delhi businessman who is visiting his uncle's family. Uncle is already dead. His uncle is Nirmal, who was a political radical, and he died mysteriously in the aftermath of an uprising. So it's during this visit that Kanai Dutt also comes across this rare artifact, the diary that his uncle maintained. And Fokir, an important character, he's an illiterate local man, a fisherman, who also guides them, Kanai Dutt and Piya Roy, through the backwaters, and there are certain interesting events that would happen which would define and redefine the relationship between them. The novel is divided into two major parts. The first one titled The Ebb, Phata, and The Flood, Jowar. The second part is slightly longer than the first part. There are also sub-chapters within each parts. In the opening chapter sets the stage, sets the tone for the narrative to follow. It's a sharp, modern opening where two outsiders, the outsiders to Sundarbans, Kanai and Piya, they meet in a railway station, and the significance of the railways also needs to be talked about. Railways being the important symbol of modernity. We find these two outsiders meeting and also parting ways soon after. But they are brought together midway through the narration because Sundarbans is a space, a real space and an emotional space which brings them together for various reasons. In this novel, we find Ghosh exploring in a rather fantastic way the personal relationship between the characters. Piya and Fokir, Piya being an American who is visiting India as a researcher, and Fokir, a local illiterate fisherman. They do not have much in common. But we find that more than the language and the culture that they do not share, there is a certain kind of relationship which gets forged between them, though they cannot understand a single word which they speak to each other. Kanai and Piya, they have a shared language, a shared culture, but they are islands apart because there is no emotional connect, though there are certain instances where Kanai attempts to flirt with Piya. He also seems to have an interest in Piya, but we do not find any kind of relationship getting forged in the narrative space. Nirmal and Nilima were together for many years, but they remain as separate islands, and Nirmal and Kusum, on the other hand, they seem to share an in-depth emotional relation. Fokir and Moina, they are also together as a couple, but they remain distant from each other. Horain and Kusum, on the other hand, they seem to share a certain chemistry. Moina and Nilima, they seem to have a similar outlook. So there are these pairs which we can find throughout this narrative space, as if this had been very carefully designed in such a way that these dichotomies will bring out the contrast and the similarities of the various characters. The author's note, which follows the first two parts, is important. It's mostly an acknowledgement of the various people, the institutes, and the kind of work which assisted the production of this novel. We find that he talks about this as a well-researched work and a realistic kind of a portrayal, but he also clarifies what part is fiction and what is not. I read to you an excerpt from the author's note. The characters of this novel are fictitious, as are its two principal settings, Lucibury and Gargantola. However, the secondary locations such as Canning, Gozama, Satilia, Morchapi and Emily Barry do indeed exist and were founded or settled in the manner alluded to here. This idea of telling the audience how real certain things are and how fictional certain other things are is something that we notice in many other authors as well. We find a brief note like this in Shashi Tharoor's novel The Riot as well. So this is also perhaps a new novelistic trend which is being explored by the Indian English authors to tell the audience directly about the kind of work that they had to undertake to verify certain historical or scientific details, and also tell the audience about the fictional elements which have been incorporated into this otherwise realistic setting and otherwise realistic telling. Critics have found many things in The Hungry Tide to talk about with critical interest in terms of thematic interest. I find the transformation of different individuals in this specific setting extremely interesting and important. We find a certain way in which the characters are introduced at the beginning, but the events which happen in Sundarbans, the events which are related to nature and the way in which it affects the individuals which are caught in that situation is perhaps an interesting thing to look at. So before we go on to talk about the other important themes, we'll quickly take a look at the transforming power that this space of Sundarbans has. Kanai Dutt comes across as an extremely educated, well-behaved young urban Indian male. But we find that Fokir, his relation with Fokir is instrumental in bringing out the worst in him. There is an instance where Kanai ventures into something that Fokir forbade him to do, because Fokir is the one who knows about Sundarbans. He knows the ecosystem well. He knows what is dangerous and what is safe. Kanai thinks he knows more than Fokir because Fokir is only an illiterate fool according to Kanai. And when things go wrong and when Fokir responds with a smile, Kanai responds in an outrageous way. This excerpt is from that section. Suddenly the blood rushed to Kanai's head and obscenities began to pour from his mouth. He began to send out a number of expletives in Hindi. His anger came welling up with an atavistic explosiveness, racing from sources whose very existence he would have denied. The master's suspicion of the menial, the pride of caste, the townsman's mistrust of the rustic, the city's antagonism to the village. He had thought that he had cleansed himself of these sediments of the past, but the violence with which they came spewing out of him now suggested that they had only been compacted into the explosive and highly volatile reserve. We find that certain elements which the secular modern self of Kanai had managed to hide well, especially the hierarchical relation in terms of occupation, in terms of caste, in terms of location, the urban versus the rural. We find all of those things coming out from a reserve. And this revelation is extremely important, and I feel that Ghosh has quite skillfully, in a very masterful way, he has incorporated this instance to show how someone like Fokir can bring out the worst in the otherwise polished secular self of Kanai. And Piya and Fokir also share an interesting relation. There is Kanai occasionally even feels a little jealous of this chemistry between Piya and Fokir. And when Fokir behaves in a way that Piya never thought he would, especially in those instances after the killing of the tiger, we find that Kanai also takes advantage of that situation and tries to convince and tell Piya again that there is nothing that Piya and Fokir can or will ever share in common. This is Kanai's words. You shouldn't deceive yourself, Piya. There wasn't anything common between you and then, and there isn't now. Nothing. He's a fisherman and you're a scientist. What you see as fauna, he sees as food. He's never sat in a chair, for heaven's sake. Can you imagine what he'd do if he was taken onto a plane? Piya, there is nothing in common between you at all. You're from different worlds, different planets. Here we find that the different worlds that Piya and Fokir inhabit, those differences were not that visible, not that important until something momentous, something significant happens in Sundarbans. But the moment Fokir responds in a way which the urban educated folks like Piya cannot acknowledge, cannot agree with, we find that they again become worlds apart. So it is, Ghosh is also trying to at some level tell us that it is not really about the individuals alone. It is also about the context which shape the individuals. It is also about certain events which would affect people in different ways based on their social circumstances, based on their the context to which they are rooted. And about Fokir, Fokir remains silent almost throughout. Fokir's language is not understandable to Piya, and we always get to know what Fokir spoke through the translations provided by Kanai. And Alok Rai talks about how Fokir remains tongue-tied almost throughout. He is not English educated, which is also one of the reasons why his voice is denied in this fictional space, and he is almost reduced to degrees of silence, as Alok Rai points out. In the space of the novel, we never hear what Fokir is thinking. We only get to know Kanai's translations. While some critics have argued that Amitav Ghosh did not give voice to this subaltern character, to Fokir, it's also possible to say that Ghosh did not attempt to pretend that he knows what Fokir is thinking. There is a certain distancing, there is a certain untranslatability in Fokir's thoughts, which Ghosh perhaps understands, and he does not attempt to do what he is not very sure of. This is perhaps what Meenakshi Mukherjee also meant when she argued that The Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh is one novel which does not betray an anxiety. Here, there is no anxiety or burden that Ghosh depicts, that he feels that the novel will be incomplete if he does not get into the head of Fokir. That one thing which he finds difficult to do, he stays away from doing it, and that perhaps brings out the beauty of the novel in a more nuanced way, because making Fokir as a tongue-tied, silent, important character, it also brings in, it also accentuates the different ways in which the limitations of translation works. Here we are being introduced, or we are being made alert to the untranslatability of the local, the regional and the native. There is one specific instance where Kanai is unable to translate what Fokir is singing. Until that point, Kanai thought that, and Piya also thought that, Kanai can translate almost everything from Fokir's language to English, which is understandable to Piya. In this section, where in this instant where Fokir begins to sing, or rather chant in a quick rhythm, Piya asks for the translation and Kanai says, "But this is beyond my power. He is chanting a part of the Bob Bibi legend and the meter is too complicated. I can't do it." Bob Bibi is the local goddess worshipped in Sundarbans by the native people. Here, when Kanai acknowledges that this is an impossible, complicated, difficult task which he cannot do, we are being introduced to this idea that there is an impossibility of perfect communication. The novel succeeds by acknowledging that there is an impossibility of this perfect communication, and at the same time, simultaneously, it successfully also asserts the necessity to communicate. Ghosh is communicating with the reader, but he is also communicating the untranslatability of certain local, native regional aspects which are also part of this nation. And this novel, at multiple level, it opens up an India which is not otherwise accessible to us, which is not otherwise translatable to us. And he also does not make the mistake of claiming that this is also an India which he also knows, which Ghosh also knows. And he also does not make the mistake of presenting all of these characters within a shared experience, within a shared culture, or within a shared mind space. Keeping this in mind, I encourage you to understand the many facets of the novel, which would also be discussed to you by Nitin, one of our students who is making today's presentation on The Hungry Tide. Nitin will be sharing the critical insights that he gained from reading, from accessing the available contemporary scholarship on this novel, The Hungry Tide. Thank you. And now we move on to Nitin's presentation.
Today I will be talking about the novel The Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh. About the author, Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta and he studied at Doon School. And for higher education he went to St. Stephen's, and he is considered often as part of the Stephanian School of Writing. And he was awarded the Padma Shri, and he is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and Ford Foundation of Art Fellow. At Doon School, his contemporaries included Vikram Seth and Ramachandra Guha. His other notable works include, in fiction, The Circle of Reason, which was his debut novel in 1986, The Calcutta Chromosome, The Glass Palace, Hungry Tide, which I will be talking about, and the Ibis Trilogy, which is his most recent work, which includes Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire. His non-fiction work includes Antique Land, Dancing in Cambodia and at Large in Burma, Countdown, and The Imam and the Indian, which is a large collection of essays. So I will be talking about The Hungry Tide, which was written in 2004. Amitav Ghosh is mostly considered a postmodern writer, and this is a proponent of postmodern fiction in Indian writing in English. And so I will just be briefly talking about the book right now before going into the themes more elaborately. The novel shifts between different time periods. The novel is mostly set in the Sundarban area, and it revolves around the topics of partition and Maurice Janpi incident. And this incident is not widely recognized now, like there are not many articles or newspaper clippings that are left right now. So most of what he talks about the incident is considered fictionalized, and that's why I think that this novel can be considered as a blend of fiction as well as fact. So the novel starts with Piya and Kanai. Piya Roy is an Indian American scientist who specializes in marine biology, and she has come here to study the rare species of dolphins, the Orcella brevirostris. And Kanai is a wealthy businessman and entrepreneur who has come from Delhi to visit his deceased uncle, and he just comes there to visit his aunt also, who is still alive. And in the process he finds his uncle's journal, which he left behind for him to read, and through a thorough read of this uncle's journal, he begins to understand the culture of the place and his uncle's experience in the place. And the author uses this journal to explore all the themes of the historical nature of the Maurice Janpi incident, as well as the partition between East Bengal and West Bengal. Fokir is a local fisherman who Piya meets there, and Piya doesn't experience a very symbiotic relationship with the government of the area present, which I will be talking about later. And so she uses Fokir prominently to help her with her research of the dolphins. And Fokir knows how to locate the dolphins because it is mythologically linked with the area, where he believes that it is a symbol for the goddess Bon Bibi, and according to her, if he follows the dolphins he will find the fish, and this is how he makes his living. Mashima is Kanai's aunt, who lives in Lusibari and founded the local hospital. The author is very playful with the concepts of time and space. He doesn't stick to one time or one space, and he chooses to explore them diversely so that he can show the representation of the people's feelings both in the past as well as the present, and in relation how the past affected the present and how the incidents have formed a sort of consciousness, or you could say negative consciousness in the present. And he does this through the journal, and the present is explored through the people present in the novel like Piya, Kanai and Fokir. and there's also mixing of fact and fiction, like I said. So the first theme I would like to address is environment in the novel. There is a very detailed description of the tide and the area surrounding the tides throughout the novel, and he shows this to show the environment is a certain character in the novel. In the beginning itself, he describes how the flora and fauna intersect and their lives intersect in the novel. Like for example, the West Bengal tiger is considered an endangered species in the novel, in that area which is the Sundarbans, which the novel is set in, but it also keeps attacking the villagers and the tribals, and it's not very, they don't have a very healthy relationship with the flora and fauna of the place. Yet you have to understand that without the flora and fauna they wouldn't be able to have the livelihoods, which is fishing or collecting things in the forest so that they can survive. So one of the main questions that this theme of environment raises is, can the people of the Sundarbans, especially the people, not exactly the people like Kanai who are quite well educated, but rather the people like Fokir, can they have a very good relationship with the environment and still function alongside it, or does it mean that for one to exist the other should not exist? The socio political turmoil also has a heavy effect on the environment. That is to say that how the government views the environment in terms of whether to protect it or whether to have the, so the huge conflict in the novel is whether to give more rights to the tribals and let them live peacefully and do whatever they want, or is to give more rights to the flora and fauna existing in the area. There are two narratives which clearly highlight the importance of the environment in this novel. One is Nirmal's journal, of course, and one is Piya's expedition, and these two narratives implicitly highlight the issues of conservation in the novel. Yeah, there is a lack of consciousness of the people because it's not been able to develop, because it's only the environment that's prominent in these kind of areas, and whatever decisions the people make are based on the environment. So conservation is also a theme that he touches upon very explicitly in the novel. Towards the end, when Fokir dies and Piya goes back to Calcutta to reflect on her entire expedition and the nature of her trip, she decides that she has to do something so that she can justify her trip, and she comes back and she forms an ecological foundation for the conservation of these dolphins as well as for the betterment of the society which exists in the Sundarbans, and she names this very symbolically. The second theme I will be talking about is corruption, and how bureaucracy and corruption intertwine in the novel and how they affect each of the characters. So even though Piya comes there as a very educated person who has purely academic endeavors in mind, she has to collude with the government to make certain decisions. Like for example, she has to get permission to go out, she has to get a boat, and she has to talk to the forest guard, and these people are not very helpful because immediately they don't want to help somebody who's like in the novel is described how they look at her short hair, the way she dresses, and they immediately form a dislike towards her and they don't want to help her. But the only person who actually helps her for the sake of helping her throughout the novel is Fokir, who is a tribal and who is a local, who has no responsibility or any obligation to help her. How he addresses it is the lack of education and illiteracy. Fokir's wife is constantly worried throughout the novel about how she has a fear of how her own child is going to end up like Fokir, and she doesn't want that. He hints that the corruption and bureaucracy in the place is what is a main reason for the lack of schools or for the lack of hospitals, which has led to this lack of education and literacy in the Sundarban areas. The next point I will be talking about is cultural and historical narratives and how they play an essential role in the identity formation of the different people in the novel. They call it a resettlement, said Nilima, but people say it was more like a concentration camp or a prison. They were surrounded by security forces and forbidden to leave. Those who tried to get away were hunted down. So this is a direct reference to the Muri Janpi incident. So I will just briefly inform you about what the incident was. In East Pakistan or today's Bangladesh, there was a struggle between the higher class and lower class Hindus, and the government of East Pakistan chose to give resources and chose to highlight the needs of the higher class Hindus in that area, and so the lower class Hindus felt that it was not a safe place for them to stay back in East Pakistan, so they chose to leave East Pakistan and migrate to Sundarbans and West Bengal so that they can have a better life. They faced a worse plight when they came here because the government of India wouldn't choose not to help them. Rather, they said that they are not refugees, rather they are trying to incorporate on our right of lands. Millions of these, not millions, thousands of these people In the novel it said around 15,000 to 30,000. So around 15,000 to 13,000 of these people were left to starve because the government chose not to recognize their status even as refugees. So they were just left to starve, and like it's described in the passages, they were tear gassed, their huts razed. Basically the government didn't want them because they were low class Hindus, and there is a religious undertone, and also there is an undertone that they feel that these people are infringing upon the rights of the tribals and the flora and fauna of the Sundarbans, and so they didn't give them their rights that they deserved, and they asked them to leave, and when they didn't leave they almost intermittently forced them to die. I would also like to argue that cultural and historical narratives form a very important part of the identities of the different people that the novel is made out of, whereas people like Fokir, their entire identity is shaped by this incident. He has a sense of belonging to the Sundarbans which Kanai or Piya don't experience, since they don't have any cultural bearings, whereas Fokir, he has to be there. He's already decided that he's a part of the place. The government or Kanai look at him as refugee, but Fokir looks at himself as a citizen or a part of the Sundarbans, and this is all because of the cultural and historical narratives that have been interwoven and shown in the novel. I would also like to talk about how the past versus the present and how these two spatio-ethical contexts are interpolated in the novel. So the past is obviously portrayed through Kanai, through his uncle's journal, versus Piya and Fokir in the present, and through the uncle's journal and Piya's modern day struggle we can understand how the past is represented versus how the present is represented, and how the present can be seen as a product of the past in the novel. So the next point I would like to be making is the mixing of fact and fiction in the novel. So there are many local myths and tales that are used to tackle real life issues, although it's not exactly the same. There is a goddess and deity in the village of the delta of the Sundarbans, called Bon Bibi, who is very closely linked with all the animals like the dolphins or the tigers, and so this leads to an imbibed sense of conservation with the tribals, which the government chooses not to understand, and the government can only see it in black or white. They either look at it as conserving the environment or helping the tribals, whereas the tribals already have the sense of nature due to the history and due to this mythological perspective. Thank you.